Well, good morning, and thank you all for being here. My name is Allison Davis, and I'm going to be giving just a few opening remarks before we begin today. As you know, last month the board issued a supplemental notice of proposed rulemaking in the EP 431 sub 4 proceeding review of the general purpose costing system. Concurrently with that decision, the board announced that staff would hold this workshop to explain the mechanics of the proposals and offer guidance on technical aspects of the SNPR. A couple of preliminary things. The presentation today will include references to the board's work papers. Those work papers are subject to the board's confidentiality agreement, and as such, we will not be discussing or disclosing any confidential information in the presentation. Instructions on how to obtain copies of the work papers are contained in the board's decision. Next, this is a presentation by staff, and as such, it does not constitute the official position or policy of the board, nor does any of the guidance that we're providing today constitute legal precedent. We'll go ahead and do some introductions. We have staff here from 3 of the board's offices. We have Mike Boyles and Paul Lowengrub from the Office of Economics, Jeff Camaro and Anika Cooper from the Office of the General Counsel, and myself and Allison Grob from the Office of Proceedings. Mike Boyles will be leading the presentation today. During and at the end of the presentation, he will be answering some of the questions that we received in advance of the workshop. There are a couple of questions that we're not able to answer today because they are getting to merits, but we will answer the remainder of them. And as you saw when you entered, there's a packet that's a copy of the presentation that we'll be showing today, and attached to that is a list of the pre-submitted questions that we'll be answering today. Also attached to that presentation is an index card where you can write down any questions that you may have during the presentation, either about a particular slide or something that we've said. And at the end of the presentation, we'll go ahead and collect them, take a short break, and then answer any of the questions that we can. We are only going to be answering questions that are submitted on the index cards. And there may be a couple reasons why we can't answer some of the questions, either because they are outside the scope of this workshop or would require disclosure of confidential information or getting to merits, but we'll review them at the end and answer as many as we can. And lastly, we will be posting both the presentation that Mike will be going through as well as a recording of this workshop on the board's website in the coming weeks. So with that, I will turn the floor over to Mike.
Thank you, Allison, and thank you everyone for coming today. Don, go ahead and switch the camera. So I thought we'd start off the day by reviewing the objectives of both the supplemental NPR and the workshop. The objective of the supplemental NPR is to eliminate the make-whole adjustment because it produces step functions and does not appropriately reflect operating costs and economies of scale. The supplemental NPR also proposes certain other related changes to IRCs, i.e. the allocation of locomotive unit miles and train miles. The proposals use the existing efficiency adjustments and cost relationships in IRCs for the basis of these changes. And these proposals are based on the principles of cost causation, cost allocation, and the practicality principle. Hitting the button twice here, excuse me. The objective of this workshop is to assist commenters, all of you, in reviewing the revised proposals and to answer technical questions about the mechanics of those proposals. The workshop will follow the same general format as the supplemental decision, in that it will cover these 5 basic areas, and we will use as examples pictures that are taken straight from the work papers. The first topic is with regard to switching costs related to switch engine minutes. The supplemental NPR proposes to use a new concept called the carload weighted block adjustment to reflect that switching is dependent to some extent on the number of cars in the block. The CWB adjustment applies a weighting to the block of cars based on the number of cars in that block. And the supplemental NPR defines shipment as a block of 1 or more cars or trailer container units moving under the same waybill from origin to destination. So what is the carload weighted block calculation? Carload weighted block calculation is the number of carloads on the shipment multiplied by the carload percentage plus the number of blocks in the shipment times the block percentage, where the carload percentage is the percentage by which switching varies by car, and the block percentage is the amount switching varies by block, where the block percentage is equal to 1 minus the carload percentage, and the number of blocks is always 1 for carload traffic. So to show the impact of the carload weighted block adjustment, here we're using an example where the carload percentage is 10% and the block percentage is 90%. And this will show how economies of scale change for each as shipment size changes. So the carload weighted blocks for a 1-car shipment is just 1. So it's 10% times 1 car plus 90% times the 1 block. But when you move to a 2-car shipment, it's 2 times the 10% plus 90% or 1.1. So while that's a 10% increase in the carload weighted number of carload weighted blocks, the number of carload weighted blocks per carload drops 45%, reflecting the economies of scale of adding the second car. Similarly, for a 3-car shipment, the total carload weighted blocks is 1.2, which is a 9% increase over the value for a 2-car shipment. And again, the carload weighted blocks per carload drops 27% from 0.55 to 0.4. And so the carload weighted blocks per carload continues to drop as shipment size increases, albeit at smaller and smaller amounts, which produces the asymptotic curve. And so ultimately the math works out that at infinity the carload weighted block adjustment would approach the carload percentage, and we're reflecting that by using a carloads of, if there were 10,000 cars, that it's just slightly over the 10%. Then the question is, how is the carload weighted block adjustment applied to intermodal? Because as I said before, the number of blocks for carload shipments are always 1. However, the number of blocks for intermodal shipment can be less than or equal to 1. So in this example, we use the average TCUs per flat car of 4. This value is reported by the railroads in Schedule 755, line 134. So the first change is to the number of carloads, which is calculated as the number of TCUs in the shipment divided by the average TCUs reported by the railroad. So the supplemental NPR uses as an example a 6 TCU shipment. So the 6 divided by 4 would get you that would take up 1.5 cars. So it would take up 6 of the available 8 slots. The second change to the carload weighted block adjustment for intermodal is in the number of blocks, which is calculated as the number of carloads in column 2 divided by that number of carloads rounded up to the next whole number. So then going back to our 6 TCU shipment, the 1.5 carloads divided by 2 it's using 75% of the block. The total carload weighted block calculation is no different between intermodal and carload. And in this example, again, using the 10% of the carload percentage, it's still the number of carloads times the carload percentage plus the number of blocks times the block percentage. So then the question is, how do we convert the phase 2 switch engine minutes to switch engine minutes applied to a shipment? And that calculation is done as the phase 2 switch engine minutes times something we've called the carload weighted block ratio times the number of carload weighted blocks, where the phase 2 switch engine minutes per carload is the unadjusted value as currently reflected and calculated in phase 2. The supplemental NPR just proposes no changes to that calculation, and those can be found in 2 areas in the work tables. They can be found in work table B6 part 2A, columns 35 through 39, and work table E2 part 1, columns 25 through 29. The carload weighted block ratio is a ratio of switch engine minutes per carload weighted block divided by the switch engine minutes per carload. So when that is multiplied by the phase 2 switch engine minutes per carload, you get a switch engine minutes per carload weighted block. And then when that is multiplied by the total carload weighted blocks, you get the number of switch engine minutes for the shipment. So then the question is, how do we determine this carload percentage that I've referenced before? The carload weighted block adjustment solves for the values that cause switch engine minutes to be reduced at the same amount that is currently done in ERCs at the minimum unit train level. The carload percentages will be different for each type of switching. For example, in industry switching, train load or unit train shipments receive a 75% reduction in their switching. That's their efficiency adjustment. In other words, unit trains are only assigned 25% of the switching of the system average. However, we can't just set the carload block to 25% because there's an interdependency between the carload percentage, the total carload weighted blocks, and the carload weighted block ratio. Sorry, this is a little math intensive, but bear with me on this. So when you start to reduce the carload weighted or the carload percentage, that will calculate fewer total carload weighted blocks, which will increase the carload weighted block ratio, which will require a further reduction in the carload weighted block or the carload percentage in order to reach the target value. And the work papers use the solver function within Microsoft Excel to arrive at that solution. And along with the work papers, for those of you who have received them, there's also instructions on how to use this work paper to solve the model. But it's important to note that the total switch engine minutes assigned using the carload weighted block adjustment is the same as those used in the make-whole adjustment. However, the distribution of those switch engine minutes across various shipment sizes may differ. In other words, the carload weighted block adjustment is a zero-sum change from the current make-whole adjustment. And the carload weighted block adjustment is dependent on the mix of shipment sizes, which differs for each railroad. So then we'll talk about what the impact is of the carload weighted block adjustment using, as an example, the 2013 waybill sample for all Class 1 railroads. And an industry switching is defined as that switching that occurs at origin or destination points in the shipment. So here the red line is the phase 2 switch engine minutes per carload, which, as I said before, reflect no economies of scale, so the line is horizontal here. The green line represents the efficiency adjustments applied in ERCs. For single car shipments, single car shipments, or those shipments from 1 to 5 cars, receive no efficiency adjustment. Multi-car shipments from 6 to 49 cars in ERCs currently receive a 50% adjustment. And I forgot to add that the reason the red line is indexed to 1 is so that it's easier to see that the switch engine minutes assigned to multi-car shipment is just half of that. So it's indexed to 1 just to make the readability a little easier. And for unit train shipments, there's a 75% reduction. So while the overall trend of the current make-whole adjustment is a reduction in the amount of switching as shipment size increases, the make-whole adjustment currently has no economies of scale within a particular shipment size, and it has a step function. And in fact, for industry switching, there are 2 step functions. So the black line is then reflects the make-whole adjustment. And the savings in the efficiency adjustments of multi-car and unit train shipments are added on to single car shipments so that it is made whole. In other words, there's a conservation of the total switch engine minutes assigned. However, this increases the size of the step function, and in this case, between single car and multi-car shipments. The blue dashed line represents the carload weighted block adjustment. And as you can see here, it's an asymptotic line which reflects different economies of scale at each different shipment size. It is solved to match the make-whole adjustment at the newly proposed unit train definition, which in this case is 75 cars. And so the carload weighted block adjustment assigns higher switch engine minutes to shipment sizes where the blue dashed line is above the black line, and assigns fewer switch engine minutes to those shipments where the blue dashed line is below the black line. However, as I mentioned before, it's an overall zero-sum change. So kind of mathematically speaking, the area below the blue dashed line is equal to the area below the black line, except for that this chart does not show a frequency distribution of the number of shipments. So while there are a lot more shipments of single car shipments and that kind of drops down, it still reflects a zero-sum change between the carload weighted block adjustment and the make-whole adjustment. And that brings us to our first question. So the question was, why was only 1 year used for the majority of the analyses undertaken by the board? And how has the board ensured that the year chosen does not contain anomalies that could affect the results it evaluated in developing the proposal? And the answer is only 1 year was used because these results would only be applied to that year, as is explained in the supplemental MPR. As such, any potential data anomalies will not affect any other year, railroad, or type of switching. There was a second question that says, that asked, the revised public use waybill sample was available for 2014 in January of 2016. Why do none of these analyses presented by the board utilize the 2014 data? And the answer to that is, since the CWB adjustment will be done annually by railroad for each type of switching, the example year does not matter. Parties can thoroughly analyze the proposal regardless of the year of the underlying data. So while before we were looking at a chart of the switch engine minutes per carload assigned, this is a chart of the total switch engine minutes assigned to shipments of different sizes. So as we can see here, the black line, consistent with the previous chart, reflects the make-whole adjustment, and you can see the step functions that are created. The blue dashed line represents the carload weighted block adjustment. So the carload weighted block adjustment reflects the principle, the causality principle, reflecting differing economies of scale as shipment size increases. And it reflects the practicality principle in tying the carload weighted block adjustment to the current make-whole adjustment, so those lines cross at 75 cars, and that eliminates the need for doing any additional empirical studies. So that was the example for carload traffic, and now we're going to turn to intermodal industry switching. So again, the red line represents what would come out of phase 2. The green line represents the efficiency adjustment, which in IRCs, it does a 25% reduction in switching for intermodal. However, there are no economies of scale currently in IRCs as shipment size changes. The make-whole adjustment overlays the efficiency adjusted line because any efficiency savings in intermodal is distributed onto carload traffic. None of it is redistributed onto intermodal traffic. And the carload weighted block adjustment line matches the current make-whole adjustment line because there are no, it doesn't distribute, there are no efficiencies to distribute. So now we're going to turn to interchange switching, having just finished industry switching. So it's pretty much the same type of charts that we just reviewed. There's not going to be as many bubble diagrams because we kind of already reviewed that, and I figured that was a little redundant. But anyway, interchange switching is switching that occurs at intermediate yards between different carriers. Again, we have the phase 2 line, which is no difference in the car switch engine minutes per carload. The efficiency adjustment for interchange switching, neither single car nor multi-car shipments receive any efficiency adjustment, and unit train shipments receive a 50% efficiency adjustment. The black line reflects the make-whole adjustment, where the efficiencies from unit train shipments are distributed onto both single and multi-car shipments. Here we have the carload weighted block adjustment, where again you can see it's an asymptotic line. It'll calculate higher switch engine minutes where the blue line is above the black line, and lower where it's below the black line. However, it's still solved for the current definition, or the newly proposed definition of unit train, which is 75 cars. There we go. This is then again the total switch engine minutes per carload, and again you can see the blue dashed line eliminates the step function in the current make-whole adjustment. And this is for intermodal switching, intermodal interchange switching. The only difference between this and industry switching is that for interchange switching, intermodal receives a 50% reduction, not this 75% reduction that we saw in industry switching. There we go. Then we'll turn to I&I switching, where I&I switching is defined as switching that occurs at intermediate yards on a rail carrier's own lines. Again, here's the switch engine minutes as it comes out of phase 2. For I&I switching, neither single car nor multi-car receives any efficiency adjustment. Sorry, this is jumping ahead too. However, unit trains receive a 100% efficiency reduction. In other words, unit trains are not assigned any I&I switching. Those efficiency savings from unit trains are added back onto both single and multi-car shipments. And again, the carload weighted block adjustment has the asymptotic line. It solves for at 75 cars. However, since the solve point is no I&I switching at the minimum unit train definition, the asymptotic line is constrained from going below 0. And so here we then have the total switch engine minutes for I&I switching. Again, you see the step function of the make-whole adjustment. The thing I want to point out here is you'll notice that the carload weighted block adjustment line is actually slightly negatively sloped. And the reason for that is because we're solving for the carload weighted block adjustment using the current efficiency adjustments in ERCs. So going from a positive value for one car to a value of 0 at unit train is by definition a drop in the switching, and that's reflected in the carload weighted block adjustment. However, when you look at the combination of industry and I&I switching, the negative slope at that line goes away. All single and multi-car shipments receive, carload shipments receive I&I switching. And so when I&I switching is combined with industry switching, the slope of the resulting line is positively sloped, and it still solves for the unit train value at 75 cars. And the reason for the positive slope is twofold. The first is that when you combine it with industry switching does not go to zero. And it's the solving to zero that causes the negative slope of the I&I curve. And then in addition, there is 4 times as much industry switching as I&I switching. And for those of you who know the work tables, you can see the equated switching factors in phase 2 is where that's defined within ERCs. For intermodal I&I switching, single car shipments receive no efficiency adjustment. Multi-car and larger intermodal shipments receive no I&I switching. And that the carload weighted block adjustment, again, matches what is currently in the make-whole adjustment. That concludes the first topic with regard to switch engine minutes. So now we'll move on to the second topic of the workshop, which is equipment costs for the use in railroad-owned cars. The supplemental NPR proposes to adjust the inputs to phase 2 for railroad-owned equipment in order to reflect economies of scale. Adjusting the phase 2 inputs also eliminates the misallocation currently in ERCs of assigning efficiencies from one type of equipment onto other types of equipment. So the work paper regarding the equipment costs has, this is a subset of that, but it's focusing on the car miles yard industry, which has a system average value of 4. And for plain gondolas, which move 86% of the time in unit train service, and unit trains receive a 50% adjustment, we would reduce the value of 4 down into 2 within phase 2 in work tables A1 part 5B column 9. However, when you look at plain box cars 50 feet and longer, since 99% of those shipments move in single car service and single cars receive no efficiency adjustment, then in phase 2 we would not adjust the value in A1 part 5B column 9 for plain box cars 50 feet and longer. However, when you look at covered hoppers have no dominant shipment size that they're shipped in. However, for car mile yard industry, since multi-car and unit train shipments both receive a 50% efficiency adjustment, and 67% of covered hopper cars move in either multi-car or unit train shipments, we would reduce the system average value of 4 to 2, again in work table A1 part 5B column 9. However, sticking with covered hoppers, when we look at, instead of car mile yard industry, we look at car mile yard interchange, which has a system average value of 2.75. Since neither single car nor multi-car shipments receive any efficiency adjustment, and 59% of covered hoppers move in either single car or multi-car shipments, we would continue to use the unadjusted value of 2.75. And the only difference is that would be put in work table A1 part 5B column 10, which has the values for car mile yard interchange, whereas column 9 had those values for industry. That brings us to question 3. A party asked, and I'm just going to paraphrase this a little bit, in the work papers provide examples of the adjustments proposed to be made to phase 2 calculations of unit cost per day and per car mile. What, if any, adjustments are proposed for phase 3 in applying the revised unit costs? And the answer to that is the supplemental NPR does not propose any changes to the equipment costs in phase 2, any other ones in phase 2, or any adjustments in phase 3. That concludes the discussion on equipment costs, and so then we turn to station clerical. The supplemental MPR proposes to use the carload weighted block adjustment again for station clerical. Similar to what it did for switching, however, there are some slight changes. The CWB adjustment solves for the values that cause station clerical to be reduced to the same value as is currently done in Phase 3, but now it's at the minimum multi-car level, where in switching it was done at the unit train level. The reason for that is because IRCS currently uses an efficiency adjustment starting at the multi-car level that is based on a function where 75% of that station clerical is based on the number of cars in the shipment, and 25% of those costs are based on the shipment itself. So again, you've seen this is similar to the previous chart, where there are no economies of scale that come out of Phase 2 for station clerical. In Phase 3, the efficiency adjustment is shown here, where single car shipments receive no adjustment. This is the function that I just addressed, which, by the way, is an asymptotic line that approaches 75%. The make-whole adjustment adds those efficiency adjustments for multi-car and unit train shipments onto the single car shipments. And the carload weighted block adjustment then solves to match the current efficiency adjustment at the multi-car level. And again, where the blue line is above the black line will assign higher station clerical. Where the blue line is below the black line, it'll assign less station clerical, and it equals the current efficiency adjustments for multi-car and unit train shipments. Here's the total station clerical assigned. The carload weighted block adjustment matches the make-whole adjustment for most of the line because it matches the current function. However, you can see down in the lower left-hand corner, for single car traffic, it gets rid of that step function. And if we zoomed in on that, the blue line would exceed the black line for 1 car, but be lower for 2, 3, 4, and 5 cars. Again, for intermodal station clerical, the efficiency adjustment is that single car traffic receives no adjustment. Multi-car and unit or larger shipments are assigned an efficiency adjustment based on that function. And again, similar to what we saw for switching, the make-whole adjustment line overlays the efficiency adjusted line because any efficiency savings are distributed onto carload traffic, not onto intermodal traffic. And then when we assign the carload weighted block adjustment, here you see that we reflect the economies of scale changes for single car traffic. That brings us to car mile costs. For unit train shipments, IRCS applies an empty loaded ratio of 2 as its efficiency adjustment. Thus, even if a rail carrier's actual empty loaded ratio for that equipment type is less than 2, IRCS disregards that more efficient empty loaded ratio and applies the less efficient value of 2. The supplemental MPR proposes to no longer set the empty loaded ratio for unit train shipments to 2. And then the question might be, well, how often does that occur? So here we have in 2013 the empty loaded ratios for Eastern Class 1 railroads, which is 6 of the 18 empty loaded ratios are less than 2, so 33% of them. But when that is weighted by the car miles in unit train service, it's 65% of the car miles. Similarly, for Western Class 1 railroads, the number of empty loaded ratios below 2 is 54%, or 13 of the 24 values. And when that's weighted by the car miles, it's 48%. That brings us to the other related changes in IRCS, as explained in the supplemental MPR. These include a proposal to increase the distance between I&I switches for carload traffic increase the minimum shipment size for unit trains, cap the allocation of LUMs for large multi-car shipments, and cap the allocation of train miles for large multi-car shipments. So distance between I and I switches. The NPR, mind you, not the supplemental NPR, but the NPR proposed to increase the distance between I and I switches for carload traffic from 200 to 320 miles to reflect that average train length of haul on railroads has increased. The supplemental NPR proposes to revise that distance down to 268 miles. Support of that proposal is done in a work paper comparing average length of haul in 1990 to average length of haul in 2011. However, parties pointed out that our previous analysis erred by including unit train and intermodal shipments in that analysis. So this revised analysis excludes those, or in other words, includes single car and multi-car shipments only, and that's what drops that the increase from 200 to 268 miles. And the supplemental NPR asked parties to comment on that versus UP proposed an analysis that had an increase to 250 miles between I and I switches. That brings us to question 4, which is, why are the analyses undertaken by the board for updates not all the same time period? The majority used 2013 costed waybill, but I and I switching miles, which you have in front of you, are based on the 2011 costed waybill. Why was this metric not revised to a more recent time period? And the answer is that because this was a revised analysis, it continued to use 2011 data in order to be directly comparable to the previous analysis in the notice of proposed rulemaking, which also used the 2011 data. That brings us to the unit train definition. The NPR, again, not the supplemental NPR, proposed to increase the definition of unit train from 50 or more cars to 80 or more cars to reflect that train lengths have increased over the years. The supplemental NPR proposes to refine the definition of unit train service to 75 or more cars. A party critiqued our proposal to move it to 80 cars, citing information that is within the IRC's work tables, which actually comes from the railroad's R1 reports. And in fact, they cite an average, while they did an analysis using 2011, here we've done it for 2012, which is looking at the average cars for through train service. I'll note that the 65 cars in through train service is already higher than our current 50-car definition for unit train. And the weighted average of the average cars per unit train shipment is 108 cars. But since the unit train definition is looking for the minimum unit train definition, or where a unit train starts, to evaluate or to compare to our 75-car proposal, we took a weighted average of the two above values to get 77.5 cars, which is close to the 75 cars. And if you do this analysis in 2013 data, it would come up with 73.9 cars. But when you go back and look at our original analysis in the NPR, we looked at where there were spikes of frequent shipment sizes, and we noted that there was a spike at 75 cars, and similarly using 2013 data, there was a spike at 75 cars. That's why we have modified or revised the proposal to use 75 cars instead of 80 cars. And all the spikes you see to the right of that, we ignored because, as I said before, we were looking at for the minimum definition of unit train. So high frequencies of shipments that are very definitely unit train is not what we were looking for. That brings us to locomotive unit miles. The supplemental MPR proposes to cap the locomotive unit miles allocated to multi-car shipments in Phase 3 to be less than or equal to those allocated to the smallest unit train. The work papers show an example of how LUMs would be assigned to a 90 gross ton shipment. If that 90 gross ton shipment were defined as a single car or a multi-car shipment, it would be assigned locomotive unit miles from the weight of that shipment relative to the system average weight for way and through trains on this upper line. However, once that gets defined as a unit train shipment, the number of LUMs allocated would drop to the lower line because the system average unit train shipment is much heavier than a system average way and through train. And what happens within IRCs is that when you then shift from a multi-car shipment to a unit train shipment, the number of LUMs allocated drops. And this is a step function, as explained in the MPR, supplemental MPR, that is not directly related to the make-whole adjustment. And so when we propose to shift the definition of unit train out to 75 cars from the 50 cars, you would still get the step function, it would just shift to the right. That's why the supplemental MPR proposes to cap those locomotive unit miles at the minimum definition of unit train. And as explained in the supplemental MPR, this proposal wouldn't change the locomotive unit miles assigned for single car shipments and many multi-car shipments, and it wouldn't change the definition for unit train shipments, as you can see by the black dashed blue line overlaying the black line for most of the line except where we would cap those values. There we go. That brings us to question 5. I'm going to paraphrase this a little bit since you all have it in front of you. But it says, starting on line 4 of what's in front of you, capping the through train LUMs at the levels reported for unit trains will result in certain variable costs attributable to LUMs for shipment sizes of 47 through 74 cars going unallocated. Because IRCS is a closed system in which all costs should be distributed over all service units, what are the board's plans for redistributing the LUM variable cost for through train LUMs above the unit train LUM cap? The answer is LUMs are not a closed system in Phase 3 the way that efficiencies from larger shipments are redistributed onto smaller shipments. That is why the CWB adjustment cannot be used to eliminate this step function. While non-unit train shipments reflect the efficiencies of way and through trains, and unit train shipments reflect the efficiencies of unit trains, the efficiencies of unit train shipments are not redistributed onto non-unit train shipments in Phase 3. Therefore, no redistribution of the LUMs is needed for this revised proposal. Question 6 is Appendix G to the supplemental MPR depicts the effects of capping the through train LUMs at the unit train LUM levels for a hypothetical shipment of 90 gross tons per carload. We understand that the point at which the proposed unit train LUMs cap begins will be calculated separately for each Class 1 railroad. As such, does the board propose developing typical system average carload shipment characteristics in place of the hypothetical 90 gross ton shipment that is used in the demonstrative calculation? And if so, from where will those characteristics be derived? The answer to that is, in a word, no. The 90 gross ton shipment used in the work paper was for demonstration purposes only. The gross tons of the shipment will continue to be calculated based on the characteristics of that shipment, and the LUMs will continue to be allocated based on the gross tons of that shipment relative to the average gross tons of the train, except where those LUMs would be capped. We're almost done. Train miles. The supplemental MPR proposes to cap the train miles allocated to multi-car shipments in Phase 3 to be less than or equal to those allocated to unit trains. So this is similar but slightly different than the locomotive unit mile revised proposal. The work papers show this chart, again using a 90-ton shipment as an example. So if that 90-ton shipment were defined as single car or multi-car, the train miles allocated to that shipment would be shown on this slanted line. However, once the shipment is defined as unit train, it gets assigned all train miles, which is reflected by the horizontal line. And in IRCs, this can actually result in a positive step function. And the positive step function can occur when the multi-car shipment at the highest multi-car level is a lot less than the unit train level, so that when it gets defined as unit train, you get this positive step function. However, that was with the definition of unit train at 50 cars. So when we push out the definition to 75 cars as proposed in the supplemental MPR, that positive step function would become a negative step function. And that's why we have the proposal to cap those train miles at the unit train level. Similar to the LUMs allocation, there is no change to the number of train miles allocated to shipments for single car shipments and all but the largest multi-car shipments, and unit train shipments there would be no difference. That's why the blue dashed line overlays the black line for much of this chart. So question 7 is essentially the same as question 5, but with regard to train miles, which is basically saying because IRCs is a closed system in which all costs would be distributed over all service units, what are the board's plans for redistributing the train mile variable cost for through train TMs above the unit train cap? And the answer is the same. Train miles are not a closed system within IRCs in the same way that efficiencies from unit train shipments are redistributed onto single and multi-car shipments. And question 8 is the train mile version of question 7. Question 6, which was, does the board propose developing typical system average carload shipment characteristics in place of the hypothetical 90 gross ton shipment used in the demonstrative calculation? And if so, from where would those characteristics be derived? And again, the answer is the same. No, that 90-ton shipment was used for demonstration purposes only. The gross tons of the shipment will continue to be calculated based on the characteristics of the shipment, and the train miles will continue to be allocated based on the gross ton miles of the shipment relative to the average gross tons of the train, except where those LUMs would be capped. Question 9 says, at page 28 of the supplemental MPR, the board proposes or explains that at this time it is not necessary to propose a change to train miles that would eliminate the potential for positive step functions. The illustration provided by the board in Appendix H indicates that the train mile allocation would be capped for a positive step function. Is the board's proposal to apply the cap for positive step functions? And the answer again is no. A positive step function only occurs when the train miles allocated to unit train shipments is much higher than those allocated to the largest multi-car shipment. Since the cap would be applied to multi-car shipments, the cap would never be engaged to prevent it from going above the unit train level. So that concludes the formal part of the presentation. We were able to answer 9 of the previously submitted questions, but there are 3 additional questions that we are able to answer. The question 10, again on the handout that you have in front of you, and I'm going to paraphrase this a little bit, but the work papers differ for the switch engine minutes differ from those in the 2013 IRCS files on the board's website. Please describe the source of the differences and provide the calculations supporting the new IRCS values, including any program coding changes to the IRCS program. And the answer is the differences between the work paper values in the e-table values and the 2013 IRCS files on the board's website are found in two places. The first is in the average miles between I and I switches, and the second is in the switch engine minutes per type of switching. The changes to the average miles between I and I switches in the Phase 2 inputs was implemented to be consistent with the other proposals in the supplemental NPR. In other words, the 200 miles used for every car type was changed to the 268 miles for everything but Topsy flat cars, where the Topsy flat car value was changed to 4163. Those input changes caused the changes to the switch engine minutes per type of switching. And in fact, parties could replicate this by downloading the Phase 2 spreadsheets from the board's website, going in and changing the distances between I and I switches in the A work tables and hitting F9, and it would recalculate it. There were no programming changes made to the IRCS Phase 2 program. Although it's just the inputs changed, the same calculations were used, but the input change caused the output change. Question 11. And I'm going to paraphrase this a little bit. The switch engine minutes work papers contains a calculation sheet and a WB 2013_segments sheet that presents totals by shipment type. Example, originated, terminated, received, delivered. How are rebill codes considered or treated in developing summaries by shipment type? And as a preliminary matter, the term shipment type the board has started to use the term segment type so that it doesn't get confused with movement type. So that segment type refers to whether that segment is originated and terminated, originated, delivered, received, delivered, or received, terminated. For shipments with a rebill code of originated and delivered, the segment type would be defined as OD, or originated and delivered. For segment type, for shipments with a rebill code of received and delivered, that segment type would be assigned a value of RD, and for shipments with a rebill code of received terminated, the segment type is assigned a value of RT. The 12th question, which I just noted might be a second question 11 in front of you. Fortunately, I didn't do the questions. How do the car types primarily used in unit train service, summarized in Appendix C on page 43 of the supplemental NPRM, change if the existing definition of unit train, 50 or more cars, is applied? The answer is they don't change. If the 50 or more cars is used as the definition of unit train service is still primarily shipped in plain gondolas, open-top hoppers general service, and open-top hoppers special service, which are the three primary equipment types if the definition is 75 or more cars. And parties can use the work papers in the equipment counts section to see what the exact change is. If you go to the WB 2013_segment sheet and change the value in cell R1, which also has a named range of unit train def, if you change that from 75, which is the current value in the work paper, to 50 and press F9, the entire rest of the spreadsheet will calculate, and you can check the counts by equipment type and shipment size and the distribution of those. And with that, as Allison mentioned, there were two questions we couldn't ask because they were merits-based. Does anybody have questions on cards? I see a couple. So what we'll do is we'll take a 5 or 10 minute break. I'm being signaled that we're taking a 10-minute break. I assume everyone's been here before, you know where the restrooms is. We'll review the questions, determine if they're merits-based or not, see what we can answer and what we can't answer. So we'll reconvene at 11:35.